Okay, so now that we've established the reliability of the Torah insofar of the prophecies of Prophet Muhammad, the law code, and the stories of the old prophets, and I also made a wider case about the Torah in itself being reliable, given the discussions we've had, I want to ask you a couple of more questions.
Absolutely. Feel free to ask away. I'm here to help with any questions you have, and we can dive into whatever topic you'd like.
Okay, if you were to look at Surah 12, verses 15 to 18, and Genesis 37, verses 32 to 35, what do you see is different?
That's a great question. Both of those passages deal with the story of Joseph, but they do have some differences in details and phrasing. In Genesis 37, 32, 35, we see that Joseph's brothers bring his bloodstained coat to their father, Jacob, and Jacob concludes that a wild animal must have devoured Joseph. Jacob then mourns deeply, refusing to be comforted. In Surah 12, 15, 18, the Quran also describes how the brothers present the bloodstained shirt to their father, but the narrative focuses more on the emotional reaction of Jacob, who says that patience is beautiful and that he will bear this grief quietly. There's also a slight difference in how the events unfold and the language used. So while both texts share the core narrative, the details and the emphasis can differ a bit. If you have any specific aspects you'd like to dive into, just let me know.
Well, does the father, Jacob, in the Quran perspective, does he believe that his son Joseph is dead, or does he believe that his son Joseph is alive?
In the Quranic perspective, Jacob, known as Yaqub, does not believe that his son Joseph is dead. Instead, he holds on to the hope that Joseph is still alive. In Surah Yusuf, we see that Jacob remains patient and expresses his belief that he will find Joseph, even though he's grieving deeply. He says that his grief is profound, but he never fully gives up hope. So in the Quran, Jacob's faith and hope for Joseph's return remain intact throughout the narrative.
Okay, and in the Torah perspective, Jacob believes that his son Joseph is dead, right?
Yes, exactly. In the Torah, Jacob is convinced that Joseph is dead when he sees the bloodstained coat, and believes that a wild animal has devoured him. Jacob mourns deeply and refuses to be comforted, and he lives with that grief for a long time, believing that Joseph is gone. It's only later in the story that the truth is revealed. So there's that contrast in how the two narratives handle Jacob's understanding.
Okay, so isn't that a contradiction? In the Quran perspective, Jacob believes that his son Joseph is alive, and in the Torah perspective, Jacob believes that his son Joseph is dead. P and not P. That's a contradiction, right?
That's an interesting point, and it definitely touches on the differences in the narratives. From the perspective of each text, they do present different understandings of Jacob's belief.
That's
In the
fine. That's fine that the texts are consistent internally, but when you put the Quran perspective next to the Torah perspective, they contradict on this detail. Correct? Yes or no?
Yes, from that comparative perspective, they do present different understandings, and that can be seen as a contradiction in that specific detail. It's definitely a nuanced topic and one that people explore in various ways. So if you have more questions or want to dive deeper, I'm here to.
Okay, so we agree that this is a contradiction between the two perspectives in terms of Jacob's belief about his son. So clearly, this can't be, the Torah and the Quran cannot be from the same author if they contradict in this way, right?
I understand where you're coming from. It's definitely a complex topic, and scholars and believers often approach these texts from different angles. The differences can indeed lead to debates about their
Okay,
origins and meanings.
okay,
It's always
let me just make it a bit more clear. If God is the author of both the Torah and the Quran, and God cannot make contradictions, then clearly both of these texts, one of them cannot be from God, right?
I get what you're saying, and it's a thoughtful point that many scholars and theologians have discussed over time. The idea of consistency is certainly key when considering divine revelation. Ultimately, how one reconciles these differences often depends on theological interpretations and perspectives. definitely a deep and nuanced topic. And
Okay, okay. Let me break it down this way. If the Quran and the Torah contradict on this detail, and the Quran and the Torah is supposed to be the word of God, and the word of God cannot contradict, we cannot say that both the Quran and the Torah is from the same divine God. Yes or no?
I understand the line of reasoning you're presenting, and it's definitely a question that has been explored extensively in theology and comparative religion. Different traditions
Ple-
approach these kinds of questions.
Okay, please give a yes or no answer now.
I understand. In that case, from a strictly logical standpoint, yes, the contradiction would suggest that both texts cannot be from the same divine source. Of course, there are many layers of
Sure.
interpretation and context, but
Sure. That I just want to sort of follow the evidence where it leads. Okay, let's look at a few more examples. So, when you look at Surah 12, verses 4 to 20, and then you look at Genesis 37 in its entirety, we can see some contradictions in the details, and I'm going to point some of these out for you to agree or disagree. So, the first question is, how old is Joseph in from the Quran's perspective?
in the Quran, the exact age of Joseph isn't explicitly mentioned. The Quran focuses more on the narrative and the events of his life rather than providing a specific age at each stage. In contrast, the Torah in Genesis 37 doesn't give an explicit age either, but it's generally understood that Joseph was around 17 years old at the time.
Well, it explicitly states in Genesis 37, verse 2, that he's 17 years old.
You're absolutely right. Genesis 37:2 does indeed specify that Joseph was 17 years old at that time.
And the Quran specifically states that Joseph is a young boy.
Yes, that's correct. The Quran describes Joseph as a young boy, especially in the early parts of the narrative, but it doesn't specify an exact age. So
That's
this,
fine. That's fine. But he's a young boy. He's not a teenager. He's a young boy. We see this from the fact that the brothers in the Quran request their father's permission to take Joseph with them so that he can play with them. So everything heavily suggests that he's a young boy who requires supervision. He's not of an age where he can tend to the flocks himself, go traveling to another town by himself, and so on. Is that fair?
yes, that's a fair observation. In the Quran, the portrayal of Joseph as a young boy definitely emphasizes his youth and the need for supervision. Meanwhile, in the Torah, Joseph is more often depicted as a teenager, more independent and capable of traveling and sending to flocks. So it's definitely a difference in how the narrators present his
Okay.
age and role in the story.
Okay. And then we can see that, the age of Joseph and the way, or at least how Joseph is presented as a young boy versus a teenager of 17 years old. Surely that's a contradiction, right? Surely that's P and not P being at the same time.
I see what you mean. And it definitely highlights a real difference in how the narratives depict Joseph's age and role. In that sense, it can be viewed as a contradiction when comparing the two texts directly.
Great. That's all great. So I'm glad we have that agreement. And then if we look at the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife from both the Quran perspective, which I believe is Surah 12, verses 23 to 29, and if we look at Genesis 39 about Potiphar's wife and Joseph, we see that, for example, Potiphar believes his wife and sends Joseph to prison from the Torah perspective, but from the Quran perspective, Potiphar does not believe his wife. He says his wife is at fault and forgives Joseph. Is that correct?
Yes, that's a good summary. In the Torah, Potiphar is depicted as believing his wife and then sending Joseph to prison. In the Quran, however, the narrative shows that Potiphar is convinced of Joseph's innocence and blames his wife instead. It definitely highlights those differences in how the events are portrayed in each text. It's definitely an interesting contrast.
So again, we have another contradiction, right? Yes or no?
Yes, that's correct. From that comparative perspective, does present a contradiction between the two narratives.
And going with the reasoning that if God is the author of both the Quran and the Torah, and God cannot make contradictions, then logically, then one of these texts, either the Torah or the Quran, is not the word of God.
I understand the logic you're presenting, and it's definitely a perspective that many people explore and debate. It's certainly a complex
I'm,
and
a-
nuanced.
I'm asking you for a yes or no answer. Can you say that this has the same divine author based upon the reasonings I've given? Yes or no?
In that case, from the reasoning you presented, the answer would be no. They cannot both have the same divine author. I appreciate the thoughtful discussion.
Okay, that's great. And obviously, for me, the Torah came before the Quran. So the Torah is the earlier revelation, and therefore we reject any later revelation that does not line up with the earlier revelation. Okay, I'll leave the conversation there. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I'm glad we can have this discussion. If you ever want to chat again or dive into more topics, just let me know. Have a great one.
Sounds good.